Hey everybody, it's Bust, continuing the spoiler season for the Fates Voyage Onward. Today, Riot has released the keyword Titanic, along with 6 new cards coming out of Freylord and Mount Targon. And so, the Titanic keyword, not so much a keyword as much as just a little bit of helper text. This indicates that a unit with either 8 attack or 8 health is Titanic. And so, this makes it just a little bit easier to spell out on the cards, makes it a little easier to wrap around your brain that this ability applies to big units. So now as we read Seismic Shard, you can say if you behold a Titanic unit, as opposed to saying if you behold a unit with 8 attack plus or 8 plus health. Just a little bit easier to go through. It's even a little bit hard for me just to spout out. So Titanic should be a fairly straightforward kind of ability, given that it's only helper text. Now, there have been a couple of rules things that have posted along with this before we come in and really talk about the cards. Riot Dirtle has made a note on the Twitter that buffed units count, so it looks at your current stats. If you are only Titanic by the merit of your health and you drop below 8 health, you're not Titanic anymore. And so if you want to say you attack with an Anaka, right? Anaka being a 6-8 unit, and then your opponent blocks it, takes it down to say a 6-5, it no longer counts as Titanic because its health dropped below 8. You can also activate this other ways in the sense that if you want to take away someone's Titanic, say your opponent has a Tryndamere on the board, you don't want it to be Titanic, so you cast Quicksand on it. With Tryndamere losing out on the 8 attack, it no longer applies, but the flip side could also count. So if you have, say, a 6-6 on the board, and then you cast Sharp Sight on it to turn it into a 7-8, now that it has 8 health, counts as Titanic. Pretty straightforward. The other thing that he calls out is the darkened cards in your hand do not count. That would have been just like the actual beast mode way to activate the Titanic ability. You just say, oops, I got Tarash in my hand, right? I have this giant unit already hanging out. I'm not certain how that would apply to Abaros. Abaros being just the Garbo card he is would probably just be a 1-1 the whole time, but the Darkens in hand do not count. They count as the equipment side. And so to move on to continue talking about these cards, the specific ones being spoiled themselves, the big key card to build around here is going to be Sigil of the Storm. This is what it looks to be like Riot is really pushing this Titanic ability towards. Sigil of the Storm. It stacks, so it's like a powder keg in the sense that you only take up one space on your board, but that one space can have multiple copies of Sigil of the Storm on it, and then your Titanic allies cost 1 less. When you play a Titanic ally, it destroys the Sigil of the Storm. And so the idea here is going to be that we play, say, a Valyr's Prophet on turn 3, we have 1 Sigil. We play another Valyr's Prophet on turn 4, now we have 2 Sigils. Now on turn 5, we can come and drop Rond, right? Rond being a 7-cost unit that now drops down to 5 because of our 2 sigils, and then he puts 3 fresh sigils on the board for us to use on the next turn. Now, as far as this mechanically goes in the course of gameplay, I'm not the hugest fan of these style of abilities. To me, they're just super high rolly in the sense that you have to draw the right portions of your deck in the right order. And so if you do all of the Sigil of the Storm stuff, right, you get 6 or 7 sigils on the board, you're ready to play Aurelian Soul for 2 mana, and then you just never draw Aurelian Soul, then the cards don't actually do anything. And then the same thing can apply on the flip side, is to where you have a bunch of Titanic units in your deck, you really want to be getting them board fast and on the cheap, so you're using the Sigil of the Storms to do so, and then you just never draw your sigils, and you find yourself on turn 6 of the game with 3 copies of Captain Farron and 3 copies of Aurelian Soul in your hand, and you just can't actually put any of your cards on the board. And so they do have that kind of high roll factor attached to them in the sense that you have to draw your cards in the right order for these things to be effective. And then outside of that, you need the cards to also not suck on their own. And so I'm really not impressed by the sigil units that we're having here on the screen. The Valyr's Prophet, you can make an argument that it's technically only 2 mana, given that you're going to get a discount on the first Titanic ally that you play, but a 2-3 for 3 mana is a pretty horribly bad deal. And so I'm not really excited about that. Moving on to the next one, the Berserker Ursine. Granted, the Berserker Ursine has a really high level of possibilities in what he can do. If you just want to think of any standard anti-gen kind of board, right, as to where you make that 1 attack and you have 5 skills hit the board, and then if you're using those 5 skills with a Berserker Ursine on the board, your next unit is going to be super cheap. But outside of that kind of combo ability, the Berserker Ursine doesn't have much health. He just trades with every 2-drop in the game, and it's very easy for him to just come down and not actually do anything. I am not excited about playing a 6-drop unit with such a small stat line that just does literally nothing the turn it comes onto the board. I've never been a fan of Curious Shellfolk. I've never been a fan of another new card spoiled that I just did not like. It wasn't Mariam. Here we go. Escalia. I did not like these kind of cards to where they come down on turn 6 and then you have to untap the next turn, and then it doesn't realistically win you the game. That's the space you're in with the Berserker Ursine. He feels like he's not going to be doing anything until 2 turns down the road, unless you have that kind of gen board already built up to where you can play the Ursine attack and then generate like 3 or 4 Sigils of the Storm. And so, not a fan of him. And then you just move on to Rond, a unit that doesn't have Overwhelm, it doesn't have Fearsome, it doesn't have Brash, it doesn't have Elusive, it just doesn't have any way to actually connect for combat damage. So this unit is just literally never dealing combat damage, and you cannot be playing 7 drops that function in that way. And so as far as this initial kit goes, I'm not super excited about it, but the way I will talk about Sigil of the Storm and where I am a little bit interested in this kind of ability is what I always call the and factor. And so if the and factor is new to you, if you're new to the channel, you're not familiar with the usage that I make of that phrase, if you want to think of these explorers that we previewed in the previous video. So you have the Armed Acquisitioner, he comes into play, you pick an Explorer spell and put it in your hand. And so the idea with these Explorers is they're generating ways to deal with problem cards. And so the most common one we're going to see is wanting to destroy a landmark. So if the format is really heavy on landmarks, we really want a way to blow up our opponent's Sigil of the Storms and their Sump Monuments, so we're including these Explorers into our deck. Like, that is reason number 1 to play it. But to me, that's typically just not enough reason, right? If you're only playing this to destroy a landmark, just play one of the better landmark destruction cards, because as we run into games to where we have our landmark destruction, but our opponent's not playing landmarks, it's just completely worthless. And so what I mean by this and factor is we're playing these Explorers because of their potential to destroy landmarks, but you can also use it with, say, Seraphine to help level her up. You can use it with Lee Sin to count as a spell to activate his barriers and challengers. You can use it with, say, a discard type element, say like a Get Excited or a Blowback. If you don't need the spell for a landmark destruction, then you can just discard it, and it's kind of a free thing to discard away. And so that's what I call the and factor, right? So you have it to destroy the landmark and to discard the Blowback. You have it to destroy the landmark and to activate Seraphine. You just have multiple things your deck can do with it besides that one thing. And so as we look towards Sigil of the Storm, you can look to say, okay, there's cards like Ziggs, right? Ziggs wants to see landmarks be destroyed. This could work with him. You want to see champions like Xerath want to see landmarks get destroyed. That can kind of tie in with him. And so while Sigil of the Storm does not unfortunately work the way you want it to with Ziggs, at least I'm certain it doesn't, right? So you have a 5 stack of Sigil of the Storms and you have Ziggs on the board, and then you play the Arsenal. Like, that doesn't just count as 5 blow-ups, right? That just counts as a single blow-up on Sigil of the Storm. I'm pretty confident that's the way it works. It's going to be super interesting if those 5 stacks do count towards like Ziggs and Xerath and they're just fucking machine gunning the opposing board. But that is what I mean by the and factor. And so it's a landmark. You can activate landmark abilities with it. You can sacrifice it to Rite of the Arcane. And then maybe if you play an expensive unit, you also get to blow up the landmark and hit your opposing unit with Xerath. And so I can see some things in that kind of sense with Sigil of the Storm. But this kind of pseudo ramp thing, I'm just not really excited about. Another thing I'm not really excited about, we're going to come down here to the Seismic Shard. I have a real tough time not calling this Seismic Shard. It's just a tough word for me to get by with. Like, you youngsters out there, you teenagers and such, you're like, what's a shard? I've never made one of those before. That sounds crazy. That's a shit and a fart, right? That's what these old people have to deal with, like myself. When you hear the phrase, never trust a fart, that's because of the shard idea. It's when you take a fart and a shit comes out. And that's just all I can think of whenever I have words like this. And so this is literally just going to be Seismic Shard for the rest of my life. And I'm not impressed with it. This is just about as impressive as shitting your pants whenever you make a fart. It just does absolutely nothing. It's just way too expensive on the expensive end. If you behold a Titanic, it's just barely better than Sunburst. And it's arguably not even better than Sunburst. That silence on Sunburst can be incredibly effective. And so I get that the Mount Targon removal is meant to be pretty bad. They're not meant to get very spectacular removal spells. That's just part of the kit of the faction. But this one is astonishingly bad, and so I don't think this one will make any kind of meta impact whatever. Even with the Titanic keyword and the Elemental keyword and adding removal into Mount Targon, I just don't really see it with this one. Maybe I'll get my. I'll be made a fool as the remainder of the set is spoiled. But with the knowledge that we have right now, I don't think I'm very interested in this one. But of all of these cards, the one I am quite interested in is going to be Herald of the Celestial Convergence. Now, this is what I'm talking about as an expensive unit that does something, right? And so, at worst, on its own, a 5/8 Overwhelm for 8 mana, not that great of a deal. But once you get to start tying this thing in with Leona, along with the new Daybreak units that Leona is getting in this set, this is just another one of those cards that should just instantly win you the game. And so if you have, say, a flipped Leona on board, you have one other Daybreak unit on the board, the way that this all should sequence out is you add your Herald of Celestial Convergence, its Daybreak activates, gains Overwhelm, Leona sees a Daybreak activate, stuns an opposing unit, and then the play ability hits to where you activate your other allies' Daybreak and Nightfall effects. And so if you have one other Daybreak unit on the board, that's going to activate itself, also activate Leona, and then Leona's stun ability is going to activate as well. And so with just our 3 units, you got to stun off 3 units of your opponents, and that's not even to mention these boards to where you have 3 and 4 Daybreak units, or you have a Ravoon down, so you're also drawing cards. It's just going to be a very, very strong finisher in a deck that had a little bit of trouble actually closing out games if it didn't have that Leona Ravoon combo attached to it. And so I think that this guy has a lot of potential within the Daybreak decks. In the Nightfall decks, I'm not as certain. It strikes me as a little bit more challenging to pull off with this guy. Like, you need just like worse cards on the board for this to be good, right? And what I mean by that is as you're playing through the Daybreak deck, a lot of the Daybreak cards are just good on their own, right? Sun Guardian is good on its own, Leona's good on her own, Ravoon has a ton of stats. If you find yourself playing something like Eclipse Dragon, it has a ton of stats. Like, these are all just good units, but like going through the Nightfall kit, like on turn 8, most of those units just suck, right? Like Diana is just like small and tiny. Like a lot of the Nightfall cards target something else, and so like the elusive guy that gives another guy elusive just isn't going to work. And you're really kind of counting on things like Doom Beast, which is not a very stat effective unit, and you're counting on things like the Winding Light, which ideally the Winding Light would have just outright won you the game before. If your game plan is to play the Winding Light, attack, not win the game, and then 2 turns later play the Herald of Celestial Convergence to win the game with your second Winding Light attack, you're doing something wrong. That's not the way these games should be sequencing out. And so I'm very kind of interested to see if things change within the Nightfall kit. Riot did come in and remove things like Dusk Undone, so you couldn't cycle and Doom Beast in the same turn. And the Nightfall kit, I assume, is going to be seeing more things in future updates, and so maybe this will be more impressive then. But with the cards that we actively have in the game right now, I'm not particularly impressed with this card in terms of the Nightfall aspect. The Daybreak, though, the Daybreak is incredibly strong. This is one of these cards that should just automatically win you the game on turn 8. The thing that really was kind of like a bummer to me with this card is it's a bird. Like, you really want to be able to shrink the cost of this unit with like Eclipse Dragon. So you can play Eclipse Dragon on turn 7 as a Daybreak, shrink the cost of this thing to 6, and then on your next turn you just play this on the cheap and you get to go from there. Like, you can run into spots to where if you're on the even attacks, this guy should just immediately win you the game. If you're on the odd attacks and you have to wait until turn 9, that might be a bit of a stretch in terms of gameplay. And so we'll see how that goes, but a welcome addition to all of the Leona kits. I'm very interested to see how this fares with the new Daybreak cards that have been spoiled, as that's a new theme that looks to be running along. And so I think I covered off on everything, right? I pulled up Leona just to make sure I was right on how this worked, right? Daybreak, or when you activate another Daybreak, and then the Herald of Celestial Convergence says activate your other allies' Daybreak, so these should work together. That's pretty good, and I think that was the extent of it for us today. And so, good stuff, interesting cards, not the highest power level, but we should see some more of this kit come out tomorrow, the final day of the spoiler season for Fates Voyage. Onward, I believe Volibear is the champion that people are assuming is tomorrow's champion. The big elemental polar bear should be a piece of the Freylord kit. And so maybe he will make some of the Titanic cards look a little bit more impressive than what we have right now. But as it stands right now, not that excited for these. But nonetheless, good stuff. I had fun with that. I hope you did too, because that is going to do it for us today. So I hope everyone enjoyed the video. Hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way, and you had a good time watching. So this is Bust, and we thank you for being here.